On the middle of Price Street, about a block east of Transit, sits a small wood-framed house that could have easily been built in the early 20th century. I'm not sure if our ancestors ever lived here, and if they did, it was not for long. But this was the address that my father's parents listed as their residence on their marriage license in 1915. The thing is about official documents is they're filled with facts, some true and some not. I found it strange that they both listed this address as their residence. Had they planned to live here after they married, or were they already living here together? In the 1914 and 1915 Lockport directories, the names listed at 37 Price Street were Robinson and Cummings. No record of a Graff. According to the marriage license, Herman Graff married Maud Amanda Knoepel on July 24th in Lockport, New York. Mr. and Mrs. Bruce LaRose, Herman's younger sister Vivian, and her husband witnessed the ceremony. The license tells us that Herman was a carpenter, and his parents were Charles Graff and Minnie Newman, all born in Germany. Maud was born in Pendleton, New York. All this information is accurate to the best of my knowledge. However, the ages of the bride and groom are listed as 18 and 29. This is false. At the time of the ceremony, Grandpa was 36 and Grandma was not yet 16, her 16th birthday being the following day. It is easy to imagine why they would bend the truth. The ages were not the only inaccuracies on the document. Maud's parents were listed as Henry Knoepel and Friederike Burmeister. The truth is, they were her grandparents. Was this also a bending of the truth? Or at the time, was this what Maud believed to be true? As I said, documents are filled with facts, some true and some not. To get at the whole story, you must dig deeper and ask the questions, why and why not? To unearth a family history, you begin with what you know. The only thing I knew about my father's family was that his mother was raised by her husband's family. My father knew none of the events that led up to that odd circumstance. Grandma once told my mother that she was sent there by an orphanage to care for a blind lady. The story always left me wanting to know more. In 1997, I visited my aunts Marian and Elsie to see if they could answer some of my questions. I listened as they shared stories of growing up in Niagara County. When I asked what they knew of Grandma's family, Aunt Marian told me that the Knoepels were Grandma's grandparents, not her parents. She believed that they had officially adopted Grandma after the death of her parents. She knew her grandmother's maiden name was Burmeister and had been told that Henry Knoepel had red hair. But what interested me most was what she did not know. She had never heard the first name of her mother Maud's mother. I thought this was an odd bit of information not to have. This became my first mystery. What was Grandma's mother's name, and why had it been forgotten? In 1997, there was no Ancestry.com. You had to do all your research in person. So I started by going to the town clerk's office in Pendleton to search for Grandma's birth certificate. The person behind the counter was friendly but skeptical. Birth records were not indexed alphabetically. 100 years ago, she told me, if a doctor reported a birth, they were handwritten in one large register. Since children were born at home, sometimes they were not recorded at all. I did not even know the names of Grandma's parents, but I convinced the clerk that since I was there and had the exact birthday, she could just check for me. I waited as she went back into the record room. After about 10 minutes, she returned with a large and dusty rectangular book. She turned the book to show me what she had found. An infant named Maud Knoepel, born to an unwed 18-year-old named Amelia Knoepel. I had not only discovered the name of my great-grandmother, but I had discovered a clue as to why it might have been forgotten. To solve a mystery, you start from what you know and you work your way back and forth and circle back around again and sometimes go sideways until you fill in all the pieces and eliminate all other possibilities. Like any mystery, you follow the clues. Clues can be found in the official records, like birth, marriage, and death certificates, or in the census records, deeds, and wills. But they are also in places. The lay of the land forged by the people who lived there. They were found in the houses, the schools, and the churches, and the graveyards. They are in the history of the community, as well as the family stories. Most importantly, they're in our DNA. But sometimes the clue can give you more questions than answers. On Grandma's birth record, the only information given for the father was a handwritten name. The cursive writing looked like Odie Ryan. Who was this man named as my great-grandfather? My search in the census records and countless other data came up empty. In fact, it was not until more than 20 years later, with the help of DNA, that I was able to discover more. By using a technique called familial DNA testing, the same technique used to capture the Golden State Killer, I was able to use a pool of shared matches that I knew were from this line of our family tree through a process of elimination and identify a common ancestor. Philip Dwyer. This is the story of our roots, a family history that spans 6 families, 2 centuries, and 5 generations, but can be told along a small stretch of the Erie Canal. A story of mystery and discovery, tragedy and perseverance. County Tipperary rests in a mountainous region of southern Ireland. From the 7th century, the Dwyer clan occupied around 100 square miles of Tipperary as the ruling family of Killimania. They formed peaceful alliances with neighboring clans and prospered through farming and raising cattle. The Dwyers reigned over their homeland for hundreds of years. Then in 1650, by order of the English Parliament, Oliver Cromwell marched through Tipperary on a quest to conquer Ireland. The Dwyer clan and their ally families fought hard against the invaders. After 2 years of battle, the English army prevailed. Lands were divided amongst the victors, and new laws restricted Irish Catholics from purchasing, inheriting, or leasing land for more than 31 years. The Dwyers not killed in battle were forced to become small tenant farmers on what was once their own land. In 1797, Philip Dwyer was born in Tipperary. The rural county saw near famine conditions in his first years of life. Violence also marked the time, as rebellious Catholic farmers protested unfair conditions and restrictive and discriminatory property laws. Unless you converted to the Protestant faith, the road to prosperity was blocked. Like so many other Catholic families in Ireland, Philip's parents refused to renounce their faith. On January 24, 1797, Philip Dwyer received his baptism in the Catholic Church. The violence escalated into the 19th century. Bad harvests led to tenants and farm laborers being displaced. As Philip grew into a man, he saw no hope for a future in his homeland. In 1820, a Canadian politician by the name of Peter Robinson devised a plan to relocate and establish 2,000 poor Irish Catholic families to Canada. Voyage to the new land would be free of charge, and each family would receive a cow, basic tools, and 3 bushels of potatoes. Over 50,000 families applied, and only 2,000 were chosen. From 1823 to 1825, 9 crowded boats made the passage with the lucky families packed on board. Philip was not one of them. Peter Robinson was looking for young families. At 28, Philip was still single. 3 years later, that changed. Catherine O'Neill was a mere 16 years old when she married Philip. The young couple wasted no time growing their family. Catherine gave birth to their first child, Johanna, on June 22, 1829. By 1830, the County Tipperary had grown to over 400,000. This year also saw a surge in violence in what became known as the Tithe Wars. Poor Catholic farmers resented having to pay to support the Protestant Church as economic conditions worsened. The Dwyer family continued to grow. Catherine gave birth to 4 more healthy children over the next 7 years. In 1836, it was 9 years before the Great Potato Famine would cause the starvation and death of over 1 million Irish. With 5 children to feed, The looming catastrophe must have weighed heavy on Catherine. From Ireland, the cheapest passage to North America came through Canada. Even so, the cost for a family of 7 would be near impossible to save. But Irish clans stick together. Those that got to a more prosperous land often sent money to help those left behind. A fortunate practice for Philip and Catherine. For though Philip was not chosen as one of Peter Robinson's settlers, 10 other Dwyers were. In 1836, Catherine, Philip, and their 5 young children, ages 0 to 7, boarded a transatlantic ship and set sail to Canada. They soon discovered one of the reasons fares to Canada were cheaper. Canada imposed no regulations on vessels coming to their ports, so passengers faced dismal conditions on the 2-month voyage. If they followed the advice of others who made the trip before them, they would have limited their possessions to 1 steamer trunk, in which they would need to pack blankets, cups, plates, and soap. Buckets would be provided. Steerage included an unventilated space lined with wooded bunks shared by a couple hundred people. The 5 children likely shared 2 or 3 bunks with Philip and Catherine. Surely Catherine had moments of regret as she struggled to feed the children with the daily ration of food. Salted pork and stale bread would be hard for the younger ones to digest. Their escape from famine came with its own risks. Thousands died each year making the voyage, most of them young children. Philip, Catherine, Johanna, Anne, Michael, Owen, and baby Mary all survived. They continued to Ontario, first to Port Hope and finally settling in Peterborough, the town name for Peter Robinson, the man who engineered the arrival of its early settlers. The industrious Irish Catholic immigrants did well. Peterborough thrived in the mid-19th century. So did the Dwyer family. Philip and Catherine went on to have 8 more children for a total of 13. They remained devout Catholics, with little Mary growing up to become a nun in the Catholic Church. Two of Philip and Catherine's 13 children were twins. When Elizabeth Dwyer and her twin brother Philip were born on July 5, 1841, their father Philip was 44 and their mother Catherine was still only 29. In 1864, Elizabeth, then 23, married William J. Ryan on February 9th at St. Luke's Catholic Church in Peterborough. The Ryan clan also had long roots in Tipperary, but William was an American, born and raised in New York State. Sadly, a little more than a month after her wedding, on March 20th, 1864, Elizabeth's mother Catherine died. The couple remained in Ontario, parishioners of St. Luke's, where they baptized their first child, Kate, in 1865. Just a year later, on December 22nd, 1866, Elizabeth's father, Philip Dwyer, also died at the age of 69. Elizabeth and William did not stay in Ontario long after that. Instead, they headed back to William's home state of New York. They first moved to Rochester, where Elizabeth gave birth to their second child, Margaret, in 1868. Since the completion of the Erie Canal, Rochester saw continued growth. But Buffalo was one of the largest growing metropolitans of the time, with a thriving railroad and shipping industry. As a laborer, the opportunity must have called to William, for by 1870, the Ryan family lived in West Seneca. There, Elizabeth gave birth to their third child, Dennis. In the following year, the family moved to the small village of Sanborn in Niagara County. Elizabeth had 4 more boys, including her 5th child, Owen, born in 1874. They affectionately called him Owie Ryan. A long way from Tipperary, the family eventually settled in Lockport and became parishioners of St. Patrick's Catholic Church. When William died in 1891, Elizabeth continued to raise her children in the faith, and the family grew to be well respected in their new hometown of Lockport. Her oldest son, Dennis, became an esteemed fire chief. But her son Owen had a wild side. He once spent 90 days locked up in the Erie County Jail for disturbing the public decency. He worked in the paper mills and lived with his mother at the family home on Grand Street till the end of the century. In the 19th century, Germany was a fragmented empire. A German did not belong to his country, but to his village of birth. In the small village of Satow Kogel in the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg, Charles Knopel, my third great-grandfather, was born in the year 1812 into a feudal society. His parents raised him to farm the same plot of land farmed by his ancestors for generations. In Kogel, neighbors worked side by side to till the land, sharing plows, oxen, and the same unfortunate lot in life. For the land did not belong to them, they belonged to the land. As serfs, they had no legal right to leave. When serfdom was abolished in 1820, Mecklenburg peasants did not gain their freedom in the way they had hoped. To purchase property, or even marry, still required permission from the Grand Duke. The wealthy ruling class hesitated to grant peasants permission to own land because they needed the labor to run their estates. This condition, in a sense, left peasants like Charles without a homeland. Fair or not, life continued. Charles gained consent and married a woman named Sophie. Sophie gave birth to her first child in 1836, a healthy boy they named Frederick. 5 years passed before another healthy baby was born. My second great-grandfather, a son named Henry, with a tuft of red hair. Sophie delivered a total of 6 children. She and Charles endured a harsh life. Mecklenburg's poor soil produced far less than other regions. Poverty and oppression seemed a hopeless reality for the next generation. In the 1840s, Mecklenburgers began leaving for America. A large group settled in Niagara County. News of fertile land and freedom traveled back to Germany. When the Knobel's oldest child, Frederick, my third great-uncle, turned 23, he knew the odds of establishing his own household and building a life in Kogel were not good. So he left his parents and younger siblings behind and sailed to America. He arrived in New York Harbor on Christmas Eve in 1860. Frederick's journey was not complete. Poor immigrants wanting to go west traveled on packet boats on the Erie Canal. Some chose workboats that were a bit slower, but less expensive. The trip from Albany to Buffalo cost about $5. The vessels were rarely clean and often crowded. But Frederick, like most passengers, would have passed the days on deck taking in the scenery until they neared a town and the boatman hollered, "Low bridge, everybody down." Occasionally, he could walk the towpath from one stop to the next to stretch his legs or gather provisions. 5 days later, he arrived in Tonawanda. Frederick left a divided nation only to discover his new country also on the brink of division. A series of events beginning just days before his arrival to the U.S. amounted to the succession of the Southern states. In April of 1861, a band of rebels attacked Fort Sumner, igniting the Civil War. Frederick watched as many of his new neighbors volunteered to fight for the Union Army. The New York 100th Volunteer Infantry formed in Buffalo and pushed for new recruits. They offered $200 on completion of a 3-year tour. Whether to preserve his new nation, secure his future, or help his family remaining in Mecklenburg, Frederick enlisted in Tonawanda on Christmas Eve, 1 year to the day after his arrival. He mustered in as a private in the Company D and remained in Buffalo training with his new regiment for the next 2 months. On February 28, 1862, the company received orders to move to Camp Winford Scott, Virginia. A month passed until they moved to White Oak Swamp. There, while performing picket duty, Frederick and his fellow soldiers encountered enemy fire. After 4 hours of holding the Confederates' check, their regiment was driven back. and 11 Union men were taken prisoner. Frederick eluded capture. Later that spring, while rushing across the Chickahominy Bridge in the dark of night, Frederick fell. His ankle twisted so badly that he had to be removed by ambulance wagon. He spent the next 9 months in a military hospital. As he lay alone in his hospital bed, he must have longed for his family so far away. At last, on December 27th, 1862, his parents, Charles and Sophie Knoepel, and his brother Henry, age 22, and siblings Johann, 18, Charles, 13, and Frederica, 7, arrived in New York Harbor on the ship Danube. Less than a month later, Frederick received a discharge for disability in Philadelphia and returned home to his family in Pendleton in Niagara County, New York, on the bank of the Erie Canal. On Christmas Day in 1863, Frederick Knoepel married Catherine Meister at the Reformed Church in Pendleton. His younger brother Henry stood with them as witness to the ceremony. A young lady named Frederica, known as Rika Burmeister, witnessed by his side. The Burmeisters were also from Mecklenburg and had come to Pendleton a few years earlier. Rika's parents, Frederick and Mary, and at least one brother also lived in the area. 12 months later, on Christmas Eve, 1864, Henry and Rika married in the same church. She was 18 and he was 23. They moved into a log house in Pendleton. Adjusting to a new land and a new language might have posed a challenge for the young couple. But they were surrounded by family, and clever Rika had already learned to read and write English. By the 1865 census, 3 other adults and 3 children crowded with them in the small cabin. Rika's older brother Ernst, otherwise known as Frederick Burmeister, and his wife Henrietta, an infant daughter, as well as 28-year-old widow named Frederica Trent and her 2 young children, resided with the newlyweds. Later that same year, Rika gave birth to their first child, Anna. A year later, they had their second child, Laura, and 2 years later, a son named Charles. The Knoepel family were well on their way to establishing roots in their new home. In 1864, 52 years after being born into serfdom, Charles became a property owner. He purchased a plot of land, Lot 69, on Bear Ridge Road. Frederick and his wife Catherine lived with them on the property. In 1867, as a United States veteran, Frederick Knoepel received citizenship. He then encouraged his father to do the same. By 1870, 273 families resided in the town of Pendleton. Charles and Sophie lived on the Bear Ridge property. Their grandson, 3-year-old Jackie Charles, the son of either Johann or Frederica, lived with them. They began making improvements to their small farm and built a frame house. The smaller cabin remained on the property. Sometime during the decade, Sophie endeavored to improve in another way. Like her daughter-in-law, and perhaps with her help, she learned to read and write English. In 1871, Henry purchased his own plot of land, Lot 73, just in time to welcome Ricas and his fourth child, Mary. By 1875, the small farm covered 5 acres with a milk cow, 2 pigs, and a house of board. They also added more children. Philip, born in 1874, and in 1876, a little girl named after her mother Rica, who went by Rachel. Coming to America more than a decade earlier opened opportunity they would never have had, but it did not shield them from hardship. Sometime before the 1875 state census, they lost their young daughter Laura. Unfortunately, this was the first of many losses endured by the family. The 1880s brought economic growth to the country, with new technology sparking a second industrial revolution. In agriculture, this meant larger, more efficient farms. But the old world way the Canoples had farmed for generations became less and less prosperous. Henry and Rika struggled to sustain a living on their small farm. The 1880 census listed Henry as a laborer. He had been out of work for 2 months in the previous year. The other 10 months, he took work away from home, leaving Rika to manage the farm and her 5 children by herself. Her aging parents, Fred and Mary Burmeister, lived with them now, and to add to her troubles, her daughter Mary suffered with seizures. To make ends meet, 14-year-old Anna lived as a servant with the Ellis family on Beech Ridge. In 1881, a child was born, but the birth was not registered. Rika was 36 years old. Amelia M. Knoepel came into the world with 5 older siblings, Anna 15, Charles 13, Mary 11, Philip 9, and Rachel 5. She spent her young childhood surrounded by her grandparents and many aunts, uncles, and cousins from both sides of her family. Amelia might have enjoyed the closeness of her many relatives, but probably also felt the turmoil that began with the death of her grandfather. Over the years, both Charles and Frederick had occupied the small cabin on their father's property. Frederick and his wife Catherine occupied the cabin on and off in 1865 and then again in 1875. But by 1880, they moved out and Charles and his wife moved in. This might have sparked the dispute over the land, but Frederick Knoepel had some demons that also might have fueled the problem. After returning from the war, Frederick had experienced short-lived success. He found work as a boatman on the Erie Canal. The work was hard, but paid well. In 1870, Frederick and Catherine lived just over the canal in Amherst with their 2 daughters, 3-year-old Mary and 1-year-old Lucy. Prosperity afforded them a live-in servant, a 13-year-old girl named Sophia. But the strenuous canal work meant standing on his feet, something Frederick could not endure long on his bad ankle. He filed for military pension, which he eventually obtained after a long approval process. But Frederick had also developed a drinking habit, and his life began to unravel. He grew irritable and prone to violent outbursts. In October of 1885, he became enraged with his then 16-year-old daughter Lucy and threw her out of the house and locked her out in the cold. Charged with third-degree assault, he spent 100 days in the Erie County Prison. Tragically, Lucy became ill after the incident and died that December. About this time, Charles wrote to the pension board claiming that his brother had suffered his ankle injury before the war and was receiving his pension under false pretenses. By the time the pension investigator came to town, there was no shortage of negative stories about the war veteran. Testimony from town residents confirmed Frederick's frequent inebriation. In his report, the investigator wrote, "Claimant is totally depraved, is vicious in his disposition, and every cent he gets goes for intoxicating drinks." Frederick protested. He claimed his brother's motives had to do with the land dispute and not the truth. He even found friends to speak in his behalf, but the damage was done. In 1886, drunkenness was considered a sign of weakness, dishonesty, and a general lack of character. This was enough to revoke his pension. Charles remained on the property until his untimely death in 1887. Eventually, Henry ended up with their father's farm. It became the home Amelia would grow up in. For Amelia, the unrest in her family would have shaken the very structure of her world, but it was nothing compared to what was to come. Anna had developed a steady cough, and her light complexion grew paler. Mary continued to be plagued with occasional seizures. In 1887, Amelia turned 6. Around Christmas time, her older brother Charles came down with a sore throat and fever. 19-year-old Charles worked as a laborer and had little time to nurse an illness. He pushed through and eventually recovered, but the untreated illness had weakened his heart. A little over a year later, Charles collapsed with fatigue. The family summoned Dr. Corman to the home, but by the time he arrived, little could be done. Charles died just 4 days after Christmas in 1888. It would not be long before Dr. Corman would return to the home. 23-year-old Anna finally succumbed to tuberculosis on February 8, 1889. The family buried her next to Charles's newly filled grave in the cemetery on Bear Ridge Road. In 1892, the family still lived on the farm on Bear Ridge. Mary, 21, Philip, 19, Rachel, 16, and Amelia, age 10, all lived at home. Both Henry and Philip worked outside the home as laborers. Henry's older brother Frederick, now estranged from his wife Catherine, lived with them. By the next year, Philip left home to find better opportunities elsewhere. Rachel found work as a domestic for a family in Lockport. Perhaps Mary would have done the same, but her epilepsy had not improved. On the 9th of June in 1894, she had her last seizure. Once again, Dr. Corman came to the home, but Mary never recovered. Soon after, Rachel developed a ferocious thirst and a frequent need to urinate. When Rachel fell ill in May of 1895, Dr. Hellwig from Martinsville treated her. When she died, the young physician determined the cause of death to be diabetes insipidus, a misunderstood condition that rarely led to the death of 18-year-olds. She was buried in Martinsville instead of with her siblings at the Bear Ridge Cemetery. With the family financially burdened by yet another loss, perhaps the kind doctor helped them arrange for her to be buried at the city cemetery. Most families in the 19th century suffered loss. Before the discovery of penicillin, diseases like tuberculosis took the lives of many young and old. But to lose so many adolescent children so close together seemed unbelievably tragic, even for those times. Henry and Rika had endured devastation that continued to compound. They worked hard to become landowners, only to find the land did not always sustain them. They raised a large family, only to watch their children taken away one by one. Amelia, a tender teen, must have felt abandoned. Her once large family had dwindled to just her and her parents. When summer ended and the children of Pendleton were preparing to go back to school, a decision had to be made for 14-year-old Amelia. Rika knew the value of reading and writing. She might have regretted that her other daughters had to leave school early to work. Now, when she looked at her remaining child, she saw her last hope. It would have been better to rest the family future on a boy. As the end of the century drew near, women were a long way from having the right to vote. But New York State recently granted women the right to attend high school. Women could earn a wage and own property. And a suffrage movement gained momentum across the country. Rika may not have considered herself progressive, but she was practical, and life had taught her the importance of adapting to the times. Amelia would stay in school. The town of Pendleton had 8 public schools. Henry and Mary Burmeister, Amelia's cousins, attended school number 1. Amelia walked down Bear Ridge each morning to school number 3. In 1897, 42 students, including Amelia, crowded in the tiny schoolhouse. She was 16. In 1899, a scandal dominated the conversations of the small town of Pendleton and would have surely shaken Amelia and her parents. Late one Thursday evening in June, Pendleton neighbors heard knocks on their doors and responded to a plea from the Tripp family to help search for their 15-year-old girl. According to Mr. Tripp, Sarah had left the house without her hat and had been missing for more than an hour. Well into the night, neighbors searched the woods and fields. When they had not found her by 1 in the morning, Mr. Tripp rode into Lockport and reported her missing to the police. Early the next morning, men heading to work discovered her mangled body on the train tracks near Mapleton Road. According to the station agent, if she had been standing, she would have been thrown from the track. He concluded that Sarah must have laid across the track in an act of suicide. As days passed, rumors emerged. Sarah Mumford lived as an orphan in a Rochester poorhouse before the Tripp family took her in at age 12. The family insisted she had been treated as a daughter. Neighbors gave a different account. Sarah often complained they treated her cruelly, and she worked like a servant. She planned to leave as soon as she turned 16 and gained access to a $200 trust. The word spread quickly that Sarah had been pregnant and one of the Tripp men responsible. A scandalous condition that might have been a motive for suicide. But if this had been true, a man of that time would have a few choices if he cared about his good family name. It was a popular opinion in Pendleton that the Tripps chose murder. The rumors intensified when the medical examiner revealed that Sarah had died before the train hit her. The coroner's jury charged Henry Tripp, his wife Matilda, and their son Lauren with homicide. Henry and Matilda's daughter Ira was charged as an accomplice. 48 witnesses were examined in preparation for the trial, one claiming to have seen the Tripp wagon riding toward the track after 11 p.m. that fateful evening. Speculation stirred that summer as the people of Pendleton, including the Canoples, awaited the trial. Everyone had an opinion to share, as new facts and rumors became all anyone could talk about. Reporters were afoot in the small town, as the Buffalo News and even the New York Times covered the sensationalized events in a series of articles that read like a murder mystery. As guilty as the Tripps appeared, the case against them was circumstantial. They were all acquitted by summer's end. The mystery remained unsolved. Amid all this scandal and scuttlebutt, Amelia quietly gave birth to a baby girl. Maud Amanda Knoepel came into the world on July 25, 1899. Neither Amelia nor the baby were sent away in shame. Though Amelia had no husband, she had parents that stood by her side and a mother who held on to hope. It had been 40 years since Rika left behind her village in Mecklenburg, where neighbors worked together to the same end. The New World championed independence, but Pendleton carried some of the same spirit of the Old World village. Many of her neighbors came from familiar parts of Germany. Rika belonged to the Methodist Church with a small but committed congregation. She drew her support from family, but also her community. No doubt, the new baby would challenge these relationships and at the same time make them more essential. On January 5th, 1833, in Mecklenburg, Karl and Sophia Niemann gave birth to a child they named Wilhelm. Wilhelm grew to be a strong man with a friendly disposition. He married Friederike Schrader, and together they had 5 children: Wilhelmina, Augusta, Karl, Caroline, and Adolf. When Friederike died, leaving him a widow with 5 children, Wilhelm remarried a widower named Johanna Kurth, who also had 2 young children of her own. He loved and provided for all his children as if they were his own. His older daughters stayed with him past the ages other young girls married. At 29 and still unmarried, Wilhelmina became pregnant. Wilhelm must have been both worried and overjoyed at the birth of his first grandchild, Hermann, on May 13, 1879. His concerns were short-lived. The father, a man named Karl Graf, made good on his promise. They married a month after the child was born. For the better part of his life, Wilhelm had watched friends and neighbors leave Mecklenburg. Many, he had heard, had found success in western New York. In 1884, he decided it was time for his family to do the same. Wilhelm brought Johanna and all the children to America, except Wilhelmina, who stayed back with her husband and child. Wilhelm and family sailed on the ship Polaria with Tonawanda as their intended destination. They arrived on November 21st. Wilhelm found work as a laborer in the growing lumber industry to support his large family. Two years later, Karl, Wilhelmina, and Hermann came to America and the family was reunited. They all lived crowded together in a house on 532 Broad Street in Tonawanda, not far from where the Erie Canal spilled into the Niagara River. Karl found work as a laborer, as did many of the men in the neighborhood. He and Wilhelmina befriended their neighbors, Fritz and Minnie Zur, who were near their age and also from Mecklenburg. In 1891, Karl filed an application for citizenship, with Fritz Zur and William Kramer signing as witnesses to his good character. In March of 1892, Wilhelmina took ill with fever and sharp abdominal pain. The family did not recognize the danger of her condition soon enough. She died of a pelvic abscess. The mournful family held the funeral at the Salem Church in Tonawanda. At 37, Karl found himself a widower with a young son, much like his father-in-law had so many years ago. Karl's friend Fritz had a sister back home, a widow with a young daughter. Fritz persuaded his father and sister and young niece to make the journey across the ocean. They arrived in New York City on July 30th, 1882, just 4 months after Wilhelmina's death. It would have taken several more days to travel to Tonawanda. Karl and Friederike Zur married on August 20th, less than 3 weeks later. They rented a house on Tonawanda Creek Road, and Friederike's father George lived with them. Hermann was only 12 years old when he lost his mother, and his father remarried so shortly after. The Graff farm sat somewhere on the stretch of the canal that cuts through the town of Wheatfield between Martinsville and Pendleton, about 4 miles from the Canopal farm. Soon, Frederica had 2 more children, Fritz, born in 1895, and Vivian, born in 1897. Frederica and Rika Canopal became friends. Their common birthplace would have bonded the two women initially. They might even have been related. Having lived in Pendleton since childhood, Rika knew the area well. Frederica did not speak English. Rika spoke fluently. She might have helped Frederica and her daughter acclimate to the new home and family. When Rika suffered the loss of her children, perhaps Frederica's sir consoled her friend. Frederica's daughter Mary and Amelia were the same age, Herman just 2 years older. It is likely they knew each other and perhaps were even friends. By 1888, the year Amelia and Mary turned 17, both girls met men from the Lockport area who were about 8 years their senior. Mary met a man named George Schaefer who had grown up in Hartland. Amelia met Owen Ryan. Both girls became pregnant. Mary and George married in 1899 before Mary gave birth to a baby girl named Myrtle. The young couple moved in with Carl and Frederica Graff. When it came time for Amelia to have her baby, Rika sent for Dr. Helwig in Martinsville, the same doctor that had attended at Rachel's death just 4 years earlier. Dr. Jacob Helwig had grown up just across the canal in Clarence, the child of German immigrants. In 1890, he attended medical school in Buffalo. He had already been gaining attention as a bright young physician. In 1899, when a child was born to an unmarried girl, it was customary for the attending physician to put OW for out of wedlock on the birth record. Rarely did they record an unmarried father's name unless paternity was certain. Not only did Amelia choose to name Owen Ryan as the father, but Dr. Helwig must have had good reason to believe her. With the name in the official record, Amelia might have had recourse to hold Owen financially responsible. He did not stick around long enough to find out. By 1900, he had left the state. Owen's departure left Amelia with few options to support herself and the baby. Her parents offered shelter, and her father, at age 59, still labored on the farm to eke out a living for the four of them. Amelia's Canopal cousins still resided in North Tonawanda with their mother, Frederick's wife, Catherine. Her older cousin Henry volunteered as a firefighter at the Live Hose Company. He knew a saloon owner and fellow live host volunteer named Charles Gloff. Charles had a younger brother named William. One way or another, Amelia made acquaintance with William Gloff. Just a few years older than Amelia, he too was the son of a Mecklenburg immigrant. In 1901, excitement brewed in North Tonawanda. The long-awaited Pan American exhibition, set to begin in Buffalo in May and run through November. Trolleys carried North Tonawanda residents to and from the World's Fair that occupied a stretch of land on the west side of what is now Delaware Park. People came from all over the world to see the fairgrounds illuminated by electric lights. Amelia did not get the chance to attend that spring, for on June 19th, 1901, she delivered her second baby girl. This time, a physician named Carver attended the birth. He insisted proper protocol be followed. Instead of the father's name, he indicated OW for out of wedlock on the birth record. Less than a month later, William Gloff married Amelia in Pendleton Center. The young couple moved in with William's father, who lived out on Nash Road. A year later, Amelia gave birth to her third child, a boy named William. Marriage did not make life easier for Amelia. She had 3 children under the age of 3, and to make matters worse, William liked to drink. His older brother Charles owned a bar on the corner of Shank and Bryant Streets. Charles lived over their saloon with his wife Minnie and 2 young children. Their daughter Ruth was the same age as Maud. As the strains of life increased, so did William's drinking. He would leave for extended periods at a time and return surly and violent. In the early spring of 1903, Amelia realized she was pregnant once again. Amelia tried to provide a good life for her children. North Tonawanda had just introduced a new program. Children not old enough for first grade could attend kindergarten. When Amelia heard her sister-in-law had enrolled Ruth, she remembered how much she enjoyed learning. She wanted Maud to have the same experience. When William's father finally threw them out, the situation worsened for Amelia and the children. The family moved into an abandoned shack on Rumbold Avenue. In the turn of the century, there were no domestic violence shelters to turn to. Still, Amelia stood up for herself. Twice she filed assault charges. This resulted in William being fined $5, then $15, making him angry and providing him with reason to blame Amelia for his failure to provide for his children. Amelia even tried filing a charge for non-support, but William implored her not to follow through. If he went to jail, there would be no way to feed the children. By summer's end, Amelia had learned to survive from one day to the next. She reached out for help, and with each failed attempt, the situation worsened. She resolved she had to rely on herself to find a way through. But when the baby's arrival neared, she knew she would not be able to feed and tend to all her children. She asked for help one last time. She found places for the older 2 children to stay just until the baby was born. Maud played so well with Ruth, it made sense for her to stay with Charles and Minnie. Maud stayed with the family above the saloon and walked to school with Ruth each day. Mary stayed with their neighbor. Amelia still nursed William, so he remained with her. In September of 1903, a heat wave came through that pushed temperatures up into the upper 80s. The shack felt like an oven. Amelia was trapped. But men had choices, and William chose to be somewhere else. He left his very pregnant wife alone with no provisions for their children. As the month neared its end, Amelia delivered her fourth child alone in a hovel with no way to call for help. Her 1-year-old boy cried with hunger as Amelia weakened with the infection spreading through her body. For nearly 3 weeks, she listened to her children cry, trying as best as she could to nurse each of them. But with her body unable to sustain them both, she watched her son slowly die. She was found a day later on a Friday. Both she and the baby were rushed to the Twin City Hospital. Her condition critical, she managed to whisper the baby's name, Marie. Amelia died Sunday night. Marie died the next morning. The Buffalo Evening News carried the story with the headline, 3 deaths in one family. Tonawanda mother and children said to have been shamefully neglected. Dr. Hellwig, so disturbed by the circumstance of the deaths, opened an inquest into the cause. In his new role as county coroner, he led the investigation, determined to seek justice for Amelia and her children. He decided an autopsy unnecessary to conclude Amelia's cause of death to be septic blood poisoning. The children were found to have died of severe neglect. Amelia's husband, William Gloff, faced with assault charges, fled town. Amelia and Marie were laid to rest in an unmarked grave in the pauper section of the city cemetery, paid for by the Charitable Society for the Poor. Most likely, the Gloff family buried young William in their family plot in Salem Cemetery. Because of the inquest, the newspaper chronicled the story of the deaths and investigation. The articles either referred to Amelia as Mrs. William Gloff or simply the mother. There was no mention of her first name, her family, or Maud and Mary. After the tragedy, Maud became an orphan in the eyes of the state. Mary had a father, and the Gloff family claimed her like they did little William. When her father skipped town, the Highlands, neighbors of Charles and Minnie's on Shank, took her in and raised her as their own. Maud and Ruth sat in Miss Holmes' classroom at the Pine Woods Elementary the day the authorities came and took her to an orphanage until a suitable placement could be found. She would never see Ruth or Mary again. On October 18th, the day Amelia died, Rika sat at her husband Henry's deathbed. The man who courted and married her 40 years ago, together they persevered through triumph and tragedy, was slipping away. Henry Knoepel died on November 11, 1903. His obituary listed his wife and his son Philip as his only next of kin. The word of Amelia and the children's death had reached Rika by then. If by no one else, Dr. Helwig would have taken the time to bring her the sad news. The enormity of Rika's grief would have been overwhelming. She had lost every one of her 7 children, her parents, and her husband. She would have been desperate for the child that she helped raise for the first 2 years of her life to return to her. When the numbness lifted, she evaluated her situation. She had a home, but at 58, Rika could not work the farm and care for a young child by herself. Maud needed a home, but without an income, a home was not enough. Orphanages at the time were less likely to return a child to a destitute family than they were to send them to a workhouse. As Maud lingered at the county orphanage, Rika devised a plan. The Graffs had invited Rika to move in with them to help Frederica, who had lost her vision. They would provide a more traditional family environment for Maud, and Rika's property could be used to contribute financially to the household. The arrangement satisfied the authorities. The day 4-year-old Maud arrived at the Graff house, everything would have seemed strange to her. She did not fully understand why she was there. She believed it was to help care for the blind lady. In truth, she was there because she was deeply loved and wanted by her grandmother. By the following spring, William Gloff had found work as a farmhand outside of Oneida. While operating a hay baler, a rope snapped, and the heavy sweep thrust back and rammed William in the gut. The other workers saw the force of the blow and rushed him to the city hospital. There he laid in agony for 5 days, wrought with fever and surrounded by strangers. On June 4, 1904, the doctor sent his brother Charles a telegram informing him of William's condition. A half hour later, Charles received a second telegram that William had died. The attending physician recorded the death as acute peritonitis. Like Amelia, they buried him in an unmarked grave. Later that same year, Rika caught pneumonia and died. Before her death, she signed the deed to the property on Bear Ridge to Frederica Graff, an arrangement to provide for an income for Maud's care and to ensure that she inherit the land that had been in the family for 4 generations. In Rika's obituary, it said that she had died while living at the home of Charles Graff. She was survived only by her granddaughter. Just a couple short blocks from where Maud had stayed in her mother's last days lived Catherine Knoepel, the wife of Amelia's uncle Frederick. After he and Catherine separated, Frederick Knoepel struggled to hold day labor while his addiction grew. The man who bravely led his family to the land of opportunity saw his slipping away along with his reputation. In 1890, it was estimated that hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans struggled with addiction. Battle wounds and most other inflictions were treated with morphine, and soldiers like Frederick, who lingered in a hospital for 9 months, went home addicted. As the pain of his ankle increased with use, a vicious cycle of self-medication took control. Although opiates were recognized as being highly addictive, the power of addiction was not fully understood. In 1894, Frederick, with the help of friends and family, petitioned to have his pension reinstated. Neighbors and fellow soldiers who had served alongside Frederick came forward to testify on his behalf. As a result, the U.S. Bureau of Pension reinstated his pension. Vindicated, he took refuge at the National Home for Volunteer Soldiers in Dayton, Ohio. There, he received treatment for his old wound, which likely would have included a regulated dose of opiate for the pain. He lived there for 8 years until his death in 1902. He died of chronic nephritis, a condition of the kidneys. Frederick and Catherine remained married, and after his death, she claimed his pension. It was almost declined due to the actions of the shady agent who advised her to lie about her separation from her husband and altered the testimony of witnesses to make it appear that his disability was related to his kidneys. None of this was necessary. The Pension Bureau had already validated his ankle injury as service-related and deemed him worthy of a pension. Catherine only needed to verify that she was his wife. Before Henry Knoepel died, an affidavit was submitted with his ex on a sister-in-law's behalf attesting to her marriage. Catherine proved to be a character in her own right. In 1913, her neighbors William and Justine Harm accused her of being a witch. A John Doe proceeding allowed the Harms to publicly tell their story to the judge. The trouble began when their 16-year-old daughter Flora came down with a strange, untreatable ailment that baffled their doctor. Believing witchcraft to blame, the family brought her to a local fortune teller. The fortune teller confirmed their suspicions that their neighbor Catherine Knoepel was the witch responsible. She warned the curse would continue to plague them until the witch was dead. The fortune teller also told them they would find 2 feathers tied together by human hair tucked in the seam of their daughter's mattress. When they returned home, they found it just as she described. The family continued to spin the rest of their story before the judge. They described how once Mr. Harms woke in the night to find Catherine peering in his window at 3 a.m. When he asked her what she was doing, she mumbled an incantation and drifted back into the darkness. Another time, the family came home from an outing to find all their furniture turned towards the wall and marked with chalk crosses. The girl testified of an encounter with Catherine in an alley. Catherine demonstrated her powers by placing a nickel on the ground, covered with a handkerchief, and told the girl to pick up the coin. The girl tried and found the nickel would not budge. Like Catherine, the Harms had immigrated from Germany, where witches were still feared in rural villages. Catherine would not tolerate further damage to the Canopal name. She fought back and countercharged the Harm family with slander. The court ordered them to cease spreading stories about their neighbor. The Harms left the state a few years later. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. The short-lived Spanish-American War became popular among the American public, seen as an effort to curb Spanish imperialism and support Cuba's struggle for independence. When it ended, the United States gained Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt emerged as a war hero, but the end of one conflict marked the beginning of another. In February of 1899, fighting erupted between the U.S. forces and the Philippine Republic, sparking the 3-year-long Philippine-American War. As the end of the century drew near, around the time Amelia prepared to give birth to Maud, a 20-year-old Herman left for Chicago. On February 24, 1900, Herman enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He served 116 days on the USS Buffalo in the port of Gibraltar before transferring to the USS Albany in June. The Albany served with the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines for 7 months of the war. During that tour of duty, the protected cruiser visited Hong Kong. They dry docked at Cavite, Philippines in December of 1900. In July 1901, they transited the Suez Canal and re-entered the Mediterranean. For the next 9 months, they cruised the warm sea, visiting ports in Greece, France, Italy, Spain, and Egypt. In June of 1902, the Albany moved to Southampton, England, where they rendezvoused with 3 other U.S. ships. A month later, in July 1902, Teddy Roosevelt, who became president after an assassin shot McKinley in Buffalo during the Pan American Exposition, declared the war over. The Navy did not suit Herman. That September, he left the Navy 2 years before the end of his tour. Meanwhile, back home, Maud grew up in the Graff household. Frederica held on to the property for Maud. In 1908, Mary and George Shaver lived on the Canopal property on Bear Ridge for a few years, and George tried his hand at farming. By 1910, he returned to doing odd jobs as a laborer, and he and Mary were living with Frederica and Carl, who farmed on the rented property on Tonawanda Creek Road. Fritz and Vivian, Herman's younger half-siblings, were 14 and 12. Maud was 10, and they all attended school. Soon after, Maud left school to work in a Lockport factory making brooms or baskets. Wilhelm Niemann, Herman's grandfather, continued to live in Tonawanda. He became a respected member of the community, loved by his remaining children. In 1910, he died peacefully in his home on Broad Street at the age of 78. They held his funeral in Salem Church and buried him in Salem Cemetery in Tonawanda. After his service, Herman continued to explore the world. He shared stories with his family of sailing in the merchant marines and raising horses out west. By 1914, he found work as a carpenter in Bedford, Ohio. Sometime in September of that same year, he drove home in a borrowed Ford Model T touring car. The worldly brother took Fred to visit his sister Mary and her husband George Schaefer in Gasport. On their way back, with young Myrtle and George Jr. in the car, a trolley car struck the Ford, rolling it twice. The accident left the passengers shaken and a bit scratched. The automobile took 3 weeks to repair. In June of 1915, Carl still worked the same farm with the help of his youngest son Fritz. Maud helped Frederica with the housework. Carl and Frederica's daughter Vivian married Bruce LaRose the previous year, and they lived in Tonawanda. In June, Vivian had a baby she named Fern. A month later, Herman and young Maud married in Lockport. Maud never knew her own father. Owen Ryan never returned to Niagara County. When his brother Clarence died in 1922, his obituary stated that Owen lived in Iowa. Elizabeth died in 1924. Her obituary listed Owen in Los Angeles. By the time Dennis died in 1935, Owen was not listed among his surviving siblings. As a child, anything Maud knew of her family history would have come through the German-speaking Frederica. It is possible that Frederica initially told her that Henry and Rika Knopel were her parents. But both Herman and Mary Schaefer would have known the truth. Sometime after her marriage, she must have heard the real story. Perhaps it was framed in a way that made her think it should not be shared. What was eventually told to Aunt Marion was that Maud's mother had died in childbirth and her father was run over by a train. Somehow, the name Amelia faded from the story. When Amelia's name was forgotten, so was the history of how a family came together. A story of struggle, perseverance, and hope, and ultimately, the story of us.